Hi, everyone. It's Rob, and thanks for listening in today. As always, I greatly appreciate your time. Today, you will hear my chat with Roshi Joan Halifax, Abbot of the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She has been a social activist since the mid-1960s, beginning with the civil rights movement and anti-war movement in relation to the war in Vietnam. In her younger years, she was an anthropologist doing field work in Africa and the Americas. She is well known for her work with the dying and prison work. She practiced with the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh for over a decade and is author of numerous books, including The Human Encounter with Death, Shamanic Voices, Shaman, the Wounded Healer, The Fruitful Darkness, Being with Dying, and her latest book, Standing at the Edge. Her first children's book will be released next year. You'll want to listen closely to the wisdom that Roshi Joan Halifax shares during our chat, as it's especially relevant to this interesting time in all of our lives. So please enjoy my chat with Roshi Joan Halifax. Roshi, thank you for joining me today on the Leading with Genuine Care podcast series. And I'd like to start by reading a quote, if that's okay with you. It goes like this: if in our daily life we can smile, if we can be peaceful and happy, not only we, but everyone will profit from it. This is the most basic kind of peace work. And that's a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. And as I'm sure you are well aware, yesterday was October 11th. It was his 94th birthday. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing the impact that he has had in your life.
Thank you so much for that question, Rob. So I was so grateful to meet Thai in the mid-1960s when he came to the United States in order to protest what we were doing, this bombing of Vietnam in the course of the war in Vietnam. And I was at Columbia University at this time, very much involved in anti-war activities and in the civil rights movement. There was an enormous peace march down Fifth Avenue. Thai was in the middle of that peace march, and he walked slowly down Fifth Avenue, causing in a certain way awe and shock to many who were on that march as the police tried to move him along. And he held his pace, really being mindful, step by step. And I realized at that time that one could be a social activist and a contemplative. He exemplified those qualities. And that, of course, set my compass in the direction that I have been going since the mid-60s. But it wasn't until 20 years later that I became his formal student. And I practiced closely with him and his community for 11 years and benefited in a really profound way from the depths of his realization, from his capacity to translate the Dharma into everyday language. And he touched the hearts of thousands or perhaps millions of people, brought them to Buddhist practice, to a practice which is socially engaged.
Roshi, in your book, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet, you write about this idea of the edge that came to you when you were walking to your cabin. And along that walk, there's some sketchy sort of areas, if I remember correctly. Many people these days, especially during the global pandemic that we're experiencing, as well as um, so many other events, are burnt out and at their own edge. And I'm just curious if you could share anything practical that we can do or think about when we're feeling this way.
Yes, Rob, I'll try to touch into this. I think that in a way, we are all standing at the edge at this time with the pandemic, with racist violence, with political churn. And also, we are in the midst of a climate catastrophe, not just in this country, but globally. Climate refugees by the tens of thousands are moving toward what they feel is safer ground, but often is imperiled ground. Now, I wrote this book really inspired and taught by many caregivers, people working in the end-of-life care field, nurses, doctors, people in human rights organizations, bearing witness to teachers, bearing witness to parents who feel as if their lives are coming apart. And I also know that feeling myself, been through it at various times. And I've realized a number of things. One is that there are qualities that are essential for psychological, social, and environmental well-being that have shadow sides, that have sides or expressions which are fraught, which are toxic, and that it was important to really understand the territory of these qualities in order to transform the problematic side, the problematic expression, into forms that were healthy. And so I explored really a set of 5 qualities. These 5 qualities are, a handful compared to, what we could look at if we had an encyclopedia. But these qualities I called edge states. And it meant that on the high edge of these states, one can see the landscape very clearly. See the landscape that is associated with suffering and the landscape that is associated with health, with well-being, and with flourishing. And that in an ideal world, all of us would be standing on the high edge, if you will. Mm-hmm. But often we find ourselves pushed over the edge, falling over the edge, losing our footing, and sliding down the mountain, and in a state of disarray, in an experience of deep suffering. And so I identified these 5 different qualities associated with what I came to know as the edge states, and they include altruism and pathological altruism, empathy and empathic distress, integrity and moral suffering, respect and disrespect, and engagement and burnout. Clearly altruism is essential in our world today. We want leaders, clinicians, parents, teachers who are grounded in altruism. And yet sometimes our altruism can take unhealthy forms where we harm ourselves in the act of serving others, or we harm others as we attempt to serve them, or we harm the institution that we're part of, or we harm the institution or country that needs our presence. This is called pathological altruism. And it is based on an altruism that is unhealthy, that is really ego-based, if you will. So part of the exploration, Rob, that I did on altruism and empathy and these other qualities involved identifying the landscape, the sort of full geography of these qualities, knowing that there's a high edge that allows us to see deeply into the full landscape, but how easy it is to go over that edge. But going over, I ask myself, what would be the leverage point, or what would be the mechanism of transformation should one find oneself in the grip of empathic distress, or of pathological altruism, or moral suffering, or disrespect, or burnout? And what I realized was that there was one inherent experience that all human beings shared, but not all human beings can access, and that is compassion. Now, I identified this in relation to my understanding of compassion, which we can talk about a bit later if there's time. But I realized that the application or the nourishment of compassion when one has gone over the edge produces the means where one can find oneself back on the high edge of any of these qualities. And it was, in a way, a very important insight, because I looked at this and I realized we don't have to seek going over the edge, but when we fail and we find ourselves, correcting course, learning from our experience, embodying humility, gaining insight from our difficulties, this produces a profound quality of strength within our own character. So that is, in a way, the premise of the book. You don't have to worry, you'll encounter failure. But when you learn from failure, when you learn from it, then that is what builds character within your experience.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you about some of the different concepts and ideas you wrote about. One of them being the idea of othering. Can you share what you wrote about that and what you mean by that?
Yes. So othering has to do with how we objectify others. Mm-hmm. We turn them into an object. And it is a real issue in our society, but actually in many societies, particularly in relation to individuals who are perceived as less than human, or less than healthy, or less than whole. So we other, for example, if we're a white person, too often people of color or indigenous people. Actually, today is Indigenous Peoples' Day, for mm-hmm. example. Mm-hmm. There was genocide upon the advent of so-called Western peoples, Europeans, onto Turtle Island. We othered Native peoples. We other people who have special abilities, who would be quotes called disabled. We other the aged, we other children, we other women. And we don't have this often, this experience in thinking about Thich Nhat Hanh again, of interrelatedness, where we see ourselves as interconnected, interdependent, and in the experience of interpenetration with all beings and things. And we experience ourselves as really separate and superior. And this produces so much suffering in our world today. I mean, we've othered the environment, called it, for example, a resource for us to exploit. Even that, and the outcome of that, of course, is this slow moving, but extraordinarily pernicious experience of climate catastrophe that we are now in the midst of.
Mm-hmm. How can we be more mindful about othering? How can we notice when this is happening to us?
I think one of the most important things is to be able to identify our biases, most of which are unconscious. And in general, we're able to do this by bringing our attention into our somatic or physical experience, because we can feel that contraction, the withdrawal from another, from the natural world or from an older person who's unwell. You feel that contraction in the body, and that is in a way like a mindfulness bell. It is a signal within our physical experience that wakes us up to the fact that we have withdrawn, are defended against, or resistant to. We feel aversion toward the so-called other. So that's the, sort of the first line, if you will, of noticing. The second line of noticing, of course, is in terms of the observation of our own emotional stream, our emotional experience, our feeling experience, which is coming from the body and which, is most obvious in terms of the perceptive or perception of our somatic experience. But then, attuning to what our affect is, what's happening internally. And then also noticing the undermutter, the talk, the self-talk, the opinions, the concepts, the views that show up as we interact with others. So part of this work has to do with developing the capacity to be deeply self-attuned and to, from that self-attunement, be able to actually state shift, to open ourselves to a kind of curiosity and respect and care that allows us to let go of that process of othering that separates ourselves from others.
Mm-hmm. You write about this concept of not knowing. And can you explain what that is and how we can apply this to our current situation, living through this pandemic together and all these other things that you mentioned at the outset? We want to know.
Knowing gives us this sense of incredible security and also identity. Our identities are articulated often around how much we know, because it gives us a sense of that we're in, we have some kind of control, and we are prediction machines. We want to be able to actually put down uncertainty and to live within the geography of certainty, which, obviously we can't. Boy, we are seeing uncertainty magnified at this time. And, from the point of view of not knowing, this is not about being ignorant. It's more about being open, not letting our opinions articulate our relationship with the external world or even our internal experience. And, my first teacher, who was a Korean Zen master, he used the term "don't know mind." I didn't really know what he meant at the time. It was years later that I realized, oh boy, he nailed it. How do we have this, what Suzuki Roshi, another great Zen teacher, called beginner's mind? How can we really approach things from a very fresh perspective? And I like what Robert Thurman has translated a similar concept. He calls it a tolerance for the inconceivable. How can we open? We can't really know what is going to happen in the next moment. And that sort of curiosity or openness or ready for surprise, like, for example, when Trump they won the election. I was actually pretty surprised when the planes flew into the World Trade Towers. And I remember the moment I learned that that happened. Again, there was this sense of real surprise. But why just focus on the big surprises? I mean, the more intimate surprises are right here. This very moment has within it, no scientist could unpack the experience of this moment. And there's this sensibility of how deep the present moment is. And it also includes, of course, the past and the future, but it also has its own integrity. And my beloved Zen teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman, who died a couple of years ago, he really appreciated not knowing. He used to say to his students, "Oh, that's just your opinion." Actually, it's from the great, from Lebowski, he'd say, "Just your opinion." And it just was like, oh yeah, that's true. So this is, what our practice can do for us, Rob, is to open us up to this sense of inquiry, of investigation, open to surprise, and of deep freshness of heart and mind. Even when, we can sort of know the answers, but gosh, I know as I'm approaching my 80th year, I am more surprised now than I was when I was younger. In other words, everything, I had a sense that I had a grasp of what the world was about, but that grasp has been actually released. Now, the world, as it unfolds in this moment-to-moment way, through travesty, through tragedy, through awakening, through beauty, even in the midst of the crosshairs of fear that many find themselves in right now. Also, for me, it's just, I am openness. I am open. I'm ready to be surprised.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I want to ask you about practicing gratefulness. It seems so simple, yet for some reason it's so hard for people to do. And I'm curious, how can we cultivate gratitude in our lives on a more regular basis? How can we bring that to the forefront?
This is a great question, Rob. I'm sure you know that Brother David Stendal-Rast, the Benedictine monk, is the kind of voice for the importance of gratefulness in our lives. I feel like the opposite of gratefulness in a certain way is entitlement. It is the sense that I am owed. But your life was given to you. Your body was given to you. Your breath is given to you. Every breath that you take, you receive it from, this very atmosphere that surrounds our earth. So what happens in opening up to gratefulness is this experience of looking more deeply into the fact that everything that we have, the clothes on our body, the food that we eat, the structures that we're living in, all of these are givens. And as givens, what is our response? Entitlement, I was owed this, or the blessing of gratefulness?
I've read that you write at least one person every day to thank them for the good work they are doing and the blessings they've contributed to your life or someone else's. Again, that sounds so simple, but I'm just curious if you could share your routine that ensures that you do that each day, because it's such a wonderful gift to do that.
Well, one of the great blessings in my life is that I'm, Abbot of Upaya Zen Center, which is the recipient of blessings every day. Really, without the generosity of others, we would not exist.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm given a huge opportunity by, if you know what I'm saying, by thanking the people who support us.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, part and party of the weave of my life. But say I'm a parent or a teacher. Say I'm a clinician. Let's just be a clinician for a moment. Look out through the eyes of a doctor. And instead of just seeing myself as giving some kind of service medically, to understand that I have the privilege of serving others. And I am so grateful to be in this position at this time, that I can offer my education, my skills, and the deep sense of the aspiration to end suffering. And that enriches my life. Instead of feeling resentful, oh my God, I have to take care of another sick person, that will undermine one's morale. It will undermine one's moral integrity in a fundamental way. So I would say that gratefulness, whether, it's like looking at your child and saying, oh God, I have to cook another meal for this kid, or wow, I am so blessed to have a child. I'm learning so much from her. Mm. And to be able to serve her and to, guide her and to learn from her is just such a blessing. I'm grateful. Mm-hmm. Or a teacher. I'm learning from my students. What an incredible role that I get to play in these young people's lives. And actually, that's a bit, what I feel. I don't teach young people, but I have many people in my life who regard me as a teacher. And it's not an unequal relationship. It's a relationship, I feel, of profound mutuality, where I feel just the sense of deep responsibility to give my best on one side, and then on another side of deep gratitude for somehow having the good fortune to have accumulated the experience to be able to share this with others. Mm. So that sense of gratitude for the role that I have. I'm quite good friends with Jane Fonda, and she has been an activist her entire adult life. But most recently around issues related to climate change. And I think that, she's 82 years old, just an extraordinarily intelligent and vital woman, but dedicated to right now issues related to climate change, and her gratitude in being able to use her privilege, her status, and her energy in service to the earth just shines out of her. And it's pure gratitude, being able to serve this way.
I'd like to talk a little bit about respect with what is happening specifically here in the United States. And we do have international listeners, but most may be familiar with much of the polarization that's going on, and some of the hate, groups speaking out again and again. This isn't the first time in our history about inequality, about systemic racism. I'm wondering, what can we do for each other to show up and have a greater respect for our fellow person?
It's a beautiful question, Rob. And I think it's interesting to look at it from the toxic side. What is it to engage in behaviors of disrespect, to disparage others, to bully, to operate out of a sense of supremacy or the direct experience of supremacy? What is it to engage in what is called horizontal hostility? That is to put down your peers. We see this in politics all of the time. It is really horrible modeling for our young people. What is it to engage in vertical violence? That is top-down violence, of saying, one of our best-known politicians, or the best-known politician, disparaging a person who is differently abled, or a person coming from another country. And what does that do to the morale of our nation, for example? By not holding others in respect and in respectful ways. I think Jimmy Carter is a powerful example of someone who didn't win his second term, but he has become, if you will, a role model for people all over the world, of someone in leadership who exemplifies the deepest kind of respect for all beings and things. At the same time, he stands within his principles and he calls out dishonor. His humility and caring, even in his 90s, with one or another cancer diagnosis, working with Habitat for Humanity, building homes with his wife, or turning, his town into a kind of solar, a huge solar farm. So this is a man who respects himself, respects others, and respects basic values and principles of goodness, justice, and care.
I'm reminded, as you speak about this, of the 5 gatekeepers of speech that you write about. Can you share what those 5 are and add anything to that where you feel it makes sense?
So this is actually a teaching from the basic Buddhism, which was adapted by a group of Zen teachers. And they're really very simple. It is like, before you open your mouth, you ask, is it true? Is it kind? Is what I'm going to say beneficial? Does it serve others? Is it necessary? And is it the right time? Is it true? Is it kind? Is it beneficial? Is it necessary? And is it the right time? I think these are such, simple but important guidelines of what it means to engage in respectful speech. Mm. And I think one of the most difficult precepts that we take as Buddhists is the precept of right speech. How do we engage in speech that does not harm? And it's an interesting process that we work with, because also this, we could say, right speech is also not speech that is fawning or engaging in compliments. And even you mentioned dear Thich Nhat Hanh at the beginning of our interview, and in his 9th precept of the order, 9th mindfulness training of the order of interbeing, he speaks to the issue of right speech, but in a very interesting way, in the sense that he says that, it is essential that we speak mindfully, but even around, to speak truthfully and constructively around issues related to injustice, even if we become objects of harm or it risks our own life. That's the end of the mindfulness training on right speech. I don't have the words memorized, but it's one of these things we're not complimenting or dissembling. When there's injustice, when there's harm, it is important to send your voice truthfully and constructively.
You write that we are in some ways addicted to busyness. And I wonder to myself all the time, what is going on out there? Why is this? And now, with so many people having to work from home, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on this idea around busyness and why we're so drawn to it?
I think that this experience of busyness, leading often to burnout, but is a kind of addiction. And it is also where we establish a sense of identity. How often do you hear this response to the question, how are you doing? And then, the person says, well, I'm really busy, as though our character is measured by how busy we are. And again, I think this is so interesting because actually in one of the wonderful moments of my early practice with Thich Nhat Hanh, he called himself a lazy monk, a lazy monk. And we think, oh, that's the worst thing possible. But what I believe that Thai meant, and he's written how many dozens of books and how many centers were established by his community and how many talks is he given and so forth. And but it has to do with an inner state of letting go, where the ego is not driving one, fear is not driving one, the need for approbation is not driving one. Actually, it's a sense of trust and ease that one brings to work. And, I remember one day I ran into Thai when I was at Plum Village practicing. He was in the small garden in the Upper Hamlet, and he was tending the mustard greens in the garden. And he looked at me, as I had kind of a question on my face. And basically he said, I couldn't write the poetry that I write without taking care of the mustard greens. But it really, it's like this kind of, this incredible ease that he brought to everyday activities. And also to the big activities of his Dharma world.
Mm-hmm. One last question for you, Roshi. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, compassion is not religious business. It is human business. It is not luxury. It is essential for human survival. What are your thoughts on compassion? And you spoke a little bit at the outset about this and how we can move forward together as one to show genuine care for each other each and every day.
This is such a big question. I'm not going to be able to address it within the time that we have now. But I think one of the first things, Rob, is to understand what compassion is. In the simplest terms, it's this capacity to really see the suffering of others and to have the aspiration to transform that suffering. But I looked more deeply at compassion some years ago and began to unpack what the elements or the suite of features that comprise compassion, what they are. And they include this capacity to really attend to the experience of another, and then to feel concern for another's well-being, and then to have the aspiration to address the suffering of another, and hopefully to engage in the actions that might be skillful enough to help or serve the transformation of an individual. So these are all trainable aspects or qualities, Rob. And I think that people have not well understood compassion, and it's become conflated with religion or things that are kind of fuzzy-wuzzy, when in fact, from the point of view of neuroscience, social psychology, and the Dalai Lama and me, and a bunch of us, compassion is, as His Holiness has suggested, not a luxury, but in fact, it's a necessity, not only for our species to survive, but for all species to survive. And it means that we have the attentional balance to perceive what is going on inside of ourselves and also in our surround. And the deep aspiration or this kind of altruistic motivation to meet the world in all its complexity and suffering, and to do the best that we can to transform that suffering. So that's kind of a short response to a very big question.
Yes, very big question. And Roshi, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today and continuing this conversation about how we, as a society, 7 billion human beings, can lead each other with genuine care. And to all the loyal listeners, I greatly appreciate you spending time with us today. And I wish you all much love and gratitude.